Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 1 today after David has had the Amalekite messenger dispatched and now begins to intone a song over Saul and Jonathan, who of course are not there. So although it says over them, they're obviously not there. And not only that, almost everybody David addresses in this poem is not there, including, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 21, the mountains of Gilboa, not only because mountains can't hear directly, but because they're in Ziklag when he's giving this little song. So there's an element of that we need to look at. But before we do, we need to understand a little bit about Hebrew poetry in the Bible and how this poem fits in with the larger books of Samuel, because I think we'll find there's something interesting there. So I have on the right side of the screen, just to give us something to work with, an excerpt from the beginning of Psalm 2. And if you'd like to know more about how to understand biblical poetry, as I'm going to give just a very brief lesson in here, you can't do any better than Robert Alter's book here that you can see, which has become a classic, and there's a revised edition in 2011 from the original one in the 80s. So if you'd like to know more, you can't get a better guide than Robert Alter. But the basic structure of Hebrew poetry is what's called two-line parallelism. There's fancier words for that in literary terms, but I don't want to lay technical terms on you. And the point being that unlike basic poetry that we think of if you're raised in the United States with a four-line poem where every other line rhymes, and the rhythm gives you the sense of poetry, Mary had a little lamb, etc. Here it's not based so much on counting syllables or rhyme as it's based on a pair of lines that relate to each other. And usually the second line is a variation on the first line that emphasizes something. So for example, we see at the beginning of Psalm 2, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? So plainly their nations and people are parallel, and conspire and plot in vain are parallel. Similarly, in the next verse, the kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together. Plainly, kings of the earth and rulers are parallel, and set themselves and take counsel together are parallel. But Hebrew poetry is not rigid that way. Sometimes there's three lines, sometimes there's a line introducing a pair. As we see in this verse, the against Yahweh and his anointed is separate from the rest of this, but we have this parallel in what they say, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. So in that sense, it forms a little chiasm, although most people don't talk about chiasms in poetry, at least in terms of the parallel lines, not in terms of the content, although the people named here are the people who were alleged to be speaking there. And you can see that pattern similarly here, and similarly here, where there's a two-line parallel and then a third line that's directing it. Here we see the flip side of that. I will tell of the decree of Yahweh stands alone, but paired here are, he said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. I have begotten you, being parallel to you are my son. Notice similarly here, the initial piece, ask of me, and then the parallel, I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. And then finally in this example, you shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So hopefully that gives you some sense of how to understand what we see here, which I've laid out in some kind of poetry, but it could be laid out in more detailed poetry. I was trying to keep it on one page to not have this key words go too long. So I'll go over that as we go. But before we look in detail at the poem, we have to understand something about how it fits in with the bigger picture of the books of Samuel. And in the introduction to the video on 2 Samuel, I noted some of the challenges around exploring the relationship between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel in terms of when each was written, and was one first and one later. And I'm not going to repeat that here, but you can go back and look at that video and the chart I put in there to give at least one possibility, although that's all it is one possibility. But however they originated, somebody put them into the situation we have now, and certainly that couldn't have happened any sooner than the exile, which is to say when the Deuteronomistic history was finished, because the monarchy was finished. And we've been noting that hint of that early on in the little allegorical interpretation of the opening scene of this 2 Samuel, parallel to other allegorical scenes, like the opening scene of 1 Samuel, suggesting that there's an exilic element there, because there's a question of whether that could be read as a judgment on the Deuteronomistic historian for destroying the monarchy itself. If that's a little confusing, again, I encourage you to go back and watch the introductory video for that. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because when we look at the three poems, Hannah's poem at the beginning, David's poem here over Saul and Jonathan, and David's final poem, which is really very close to Psalm 18 at the end, we're going to see some very close connections. And I'm torn here in presenting this to you between having it probably too small for you to read it, but having it small enough that you can see all the parallels. And so I want to show it small so you can see the color coordination, and then I'll zoom in on some elements. But the primary point I want you to see is, you can just see from the color coordination, there are strong links here between Hannah's song in 1 Samuel and David's long psalm in 2 Samuel 22. Notice here it's 10 verses and here it's 11 verses, but here it's 50 verses, and hence continuing on to the next page in 10-point type as opposed to the 12-point type here. But we can see right away that Hannah refers to God as a rock, and David refers to God as a rock. So I won't go over every parallel, and I'll post it at radicalbible.net, but you can see a number of those. You notice that the one we're on now has more of this blue, which is focused around the use of Gibor, mighty, which is here and is down here as well. But there's not as many parallels there. But the one that we do have, shield, and notice I have a little footnote to that, which I want to go to now and make that bigger so we can see. 4 elements of what I've noted here with footnotes. The Hebrew word for to exalt, not pronounceable without vowels here, is only in 1 Samuel 9:24 in the books of Samuel outside the first and third poems. So it's in Hannah's song and in David's psalm, if you will, in 2 Samuel 22. The Hebrew for shield, magen, is only in the second and third poems in the books of Samuel. The Hebrew for darkness, husek, is only in the first and third, as exalt is only in the first and third. And the Hebrew for the phrase gird on strength, zir chayil, is only in the first and third in the entire Bible, although it's also in Psalm 18, which is the parallel version of what we see in David's song in 2 Samuel 22. So we notice that 3 of these link the first and third, and shield links the second and third. And so when we look back here at a level that you can see the whole thing, we can see how tightly they're all connected. One at the beginning, one at the end, and one in the middle. And yet, apart from their structural place, they're telling us something very interesting. And I won't go through all of it because obviously we're immediately on this passage and that's my focus. But to give you a sense of what we're aiming at, notice that Hannah's poem ends with, God, Yahweh, here will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. And David ends his song with, God is a tower of salvation for his king and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. So what Hannah was saying here in the abstract, when there of course was no king yet, and this is, as you can see, in 1 Samuel 2, and the quest for a king doesn't come up until 1 Samuel 8, anticipating that, and it finds its fulfillment in David. So whether we think that is a pro-David, pro-monarchy perspective, or simply showing an element of the character of David, because as we'll see when we get to 2 Samuel 22, the part in black here is not parallel, and I highlight it, though, to highlight the center of this and what it's bringing forth in terms of content. Yahweh rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of Yahweh and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his ordinances were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. Therefore Yahweh has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. And notice the symmetry there. It's a little bit of a chiasm, which we won't look at now. Do we believe that's true? Well, we're only in the beginning of 2 Samuel, so it's too soon to judge. But I would keep that before us until we get to the end, and I'll repeat it a number of times to highlight that, to say that at the end, somebody is put in David's mouth, and maybe it's from David's mouth originally, it's hard to say, his explanation that he's been nothing but innocent, nothing but righteous, nothing but loyal to Yahweh the whole way. Does he include in that having Uriah killed and taking Bathsheba from him, and some of the other things that almost anybody would question, apart from what we've already seen, which is that he's dangerously close but constantly disclaiming he has anything to do with the violence that happens all around him, whether that was to Saul and Jonathan or to Saul's son, as we'll see in the upcoming chapters, or to others that I was highlighting in that chart about brotherly murder. So a number of elements that we have to pay attention to as we go. So with those elements of poetry in mind, let's just look at our first verses, and I'll leave it up here so we can see some of the key words as we look at the details, and we'll go through the first part of it today. So David intoned this lamentation, literally sang a dirge according to the lexicon. In the Septuagint, it's a word for wait or lament, and it's elsewhere in the prophets for the kind of things you'd expect after exile, for singing a dirge. Although here it's not for exile, it's for the death of Saul and Jonathan. And intoned this lamentation, which is, as one scholar notes, a wordplay lost in translation, literally keened this keening here, over Saul and his son Jonathan. So the narrator provides that introduction and then a further introduction, and it's put in parentheses by the NORSV to suggest that it's somehow out of order or it doesn't belong there, but there's no particular reason to think that. As one commentator notes below, in this regard, David is a forerunner of Lincoln and Churchill in teaching people something that becomes a state song or a state memory here. But whether you think David is a forerunner of Lincoln and Churchill, you'll have to decide for yourself. We have to look at the language here carefully, as Weitzman notes here. The New RSV has, he ordered that the song of the bow be taught to the people of Judah. But literally the Hebrew is, and he said to teach the sons of Judah a bow, which is to say there's no word for song in here, and it's the sons of Judah, not the people of Judah, which is traditional, and the New RSV, like many modern translations, creates gender-inclusive language when it refers to male language there. Some more suggests that this phrasing makes a possible link in connection with military training, and that may be, especially since David is certainly around his military people, but the people of Judah together are a larger group than what we might call an army, even though, as I've noted, there is no specific word for army we've been hearing. It's the word for people. So he ordered this song of the bow, and why is it called Quasheth, or the bowman, which we see earlier associated with Jonathan, and then we saw it associated with Saul's death in 31:3. It's also one of the connections with Genesis, with Esau in Genesis 27:3. And we'll be looking more as we go at many of the connections with Genesis, especially in 2 Samuel 2. We'll see several specific ones. So he's teaching them the bow, which isn't exactly clear what that's about, because there's really nothing about bows in this story here. And it's taught to the people of Judah, which is very interesting, because just a few verses earlier we heard that there was a lament for the house of Israel. And Judah will be described as the house of Judah in just a few verses in 2:4 for the first time. But since Saul was king over Israel, and it's the house of Israel that's lamenting, why is David ordering it that it be taught to the people of Judah? And as many scholars have noted, Judah is something that he's inventing as a polity. Certainly Judah is described in Genesis as one of the children of Jacob, of course, although not a child of Rachel. So it would be a real question, if we're looking at Genesis, of why Judah would seem to be the lead individually named child. He's not the firstborn. He's not the child of the preferred wife. The children of Rachel are Joseph and Benjamin. But we'll see that Judah becomes the place from which David establishes his claim to monarchy, and Israel comes along as the tail on the dog, so to speak. So it says it is written in the book of Yasher here. The New RSV, as often does, omits the behold, henna here. The book of Yasher here, Yasher means straight or level or right or pleasing. But the only other reference to the book of Yasher is in Joshua 10:13. And notice there's a little play on words there between Joshua and Yasher. But there's no evidence of such a book. Scholars assume that there was something, but we just don't know, and there's no other reference to it. And it perhaps is a fiction of the Deuteronomistic historian, although why that would be isn't clear. There's just not enough data for us to know. So with that introduction, we get into the poem itself. As we look at the overall thing, the overall poem, here's a couple of notes to bring in from scholars reading the whole thing. So one has, David's lament over Saul, quote, possesses an archaic linguistic style and makes the political narrative into a liturgical work. And we'll see examples of that along the way, because there are several words that relate here to offering sacrifices and things that we associate with Hebrew liturgy or Israelite or Judahite liturgy, especially liturgy in the temple, which of course doesn't exist yet in the story. Todd Linnefelt notes here that David addresses his poem to absent hearers, and that was my point earlier, but we can see his whole argument. Israel, unable to respond because absent. The hills of Gilboa because inanimate and also absent. The daughters of Israel because absent. And Jonathan because dead. He goes on to note the role of apostrophe here, the literary element of apostrophe, to mark David's poem as between private and public, between personal lament and public rhetoric. And we'll see a similar thing in the lament over Abner in a couple of chapters. So some serious translation issues here, because the normal word for glory is kabod, and this is not that. This is shebi, which also means gazelle, which is how it's translated in Deuteronomy as an unclean or a clean animal. The refrain is repeated here in 125 here, so we can see, but Jonathan takes the place of shebi here, and so we need to look at that. But it literally means gazelle, and we can read it that way, and one scholar has. But before we can get to that, we have to look at a couple more words to make the connection. So it lies slain upon your high places, using halal, which is again framed here as we see. But it's a word commonly used about, as Polza notes, about cultic pollution. In Samuel, we saw it just earlier in the report of the death of Saul, the original death of Saul, and we see it here. And so it's one connection there. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's very common in Leviticus and Numbers for describing things related to sacrifices. So there's one element of that there, and we'll see more. And then upon your high places, al bemoteka, which is out of historical context here, because high places are things that are alternative places to the temple that are condemned and destroyed, or at least the people on them destroyed, in the so-called reform of Josiah in 2 Kings 23. This is before that, so we can't know it as that particular association here. But again, as Polza notes below, it not only recalls the particular circumstances of Saul's death, which is that he died on a mountain, but also foreshadows the Deuteronomistic historians' devastating critique of the idolatry that will characterize Israel's monarchic history after the temple is built, which is to say, worship on high places. More recently, Barak, writing an article just on the poem, argues that the word refers to a part of the upper body, high here, as in Deuteronomy 33:29. Let's look at that to see what he's talking about here. So you shall tread on their backs is the point there. And so he follows that up, following up Friedman's 1964 proposal. It's not very often that recent scholars appeal to things that are that old, but here I think it makes sense. And so he suggests translating this, O gazelle of Israel, slain upon thy back, or upon your back, referring to Jonathan, and making it even more parallel here. And as he notes there, provides an ironic coda to the David-Jonathan relationship, reversing David's face-down obeisance before Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20:41, which we can go back to and see here, where he prostrated himself with his face to the ground before Jonathan there. So now, of course, Jonathan is dead, but not literally in front of him as a part of that. So whether we hear this as the glory of Israel or the gazelle of Israel, referring specifically to Jonathan as one who is swift, which we'll see a little bit later, is up to the translation issue there. And then we get this refrain, which has become a meme, as you can see here from just finding it on the internet, how the mighty have fallen. And it's repeated 3 times total, and hence it becomes part of the key words. And each word is a key word. Mighty, Gibborim here is a plural, as we see, and fallen 3 times. So Gibbor, we know from Goliath in here, but it's also the people in Genesis 6 who take earthly women and give birth to something else. I'm sorry, give birth to the Gibborim. It's the gods from above who take, or the sons of God as they're described, who take women and give birth to the Gibborim, the mighty. So generally a word apart from the mythological explanation of their origin in Genesis 6, referring to powerful people, and almost always certainly men. I don't know any example that's not male here. So this becomes a refrain, how the mighty have fallen. Is that being celebrated, lamented, or just named? It is not clear at this point. We'll have to read the whole thing to know. Then it shifts, and my note below has, why just these 2 Philistine cities out of the 5 that we know, and we'll look at that in a moment. Telanot and Gath, which is where David was working for Asich, mentioned back in chapter 27, when the leaders of the Philistines suspected that David was loyal to Saul, and he pretended to be insane by drooling and scratching on the door, and they pushed him away. So that's the memory of Gath. And notice the parallel in the poetry. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ascalon. The word for proclaim it not here, though, Basar here, as Galpes Feller, whose work we've already looked at in the first part of the chapter, notes, the only time the term appears in the Bible in connection with bad news. And he notes the link, as we already saw, between the death of Saul and the fall of Eli back in 1 Samuel 4:17. Why the streets of Ascalon isn't clear. That's where the ark was taken, and we can go back and look at that to see the only other reference. But there it's named as just one of the 5 cities where the 5 golden mice representing the tumors there were presented as part of the comedic scene there. So it's not clear why these two are singled out other than to make the poetic parallel. So tell it not there, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, of course, at the death of Saul. How they feel about Jonathan, we don't know, although there was a scene where Jonathan and his armor bearer, his young man, took them on at the Battle of Michmash earlier in 1 Samuel, as we saw. And as part of the parallel, the daughters of the uncircumcised will exult here, recalling elements of that and the uncircumcised. You mountains of Gilboa, addressing them directly, let there be no dew or rain upon you. So giving a curse to the mountains, and of course a human curse is not the same as a divine curse, so it's more like a wish. It's really just part of the poem here, not suggesting there's any power to make that done. But the word for dew, tal, is only one other time in Samuel. We see it in Kings. But it's interestingly in the Exodus story in chapter 16 about the manna. So something like dew falls, and in the morning they find that it's manna. So perhaps an element there connecting it to the fertility of that, and certainly of rain. Nor your bounteous fields, an interesting word for bounteous here, turamuthir, only here in the Deuteronomistic history, except Deuteronomy 12:16. And 12:6, 11, and 17, rather, I'm sorry. But it's frequent in the Torah for offerings or contributions, again, in the sense of worship. So part of that subtext here of liturgical element in the story here, which is very interesting given that in the story of Samuel, we don't know anything about that. There's no temple yet, and so there's no place to make those kinds of offerings. Again, a hint that the story is coming from a later time when people know about Leviticus and they know about the temple. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled. And the word for shield here is magen, which is a frequent word for Yahweh. But the magen David is what you see here on the flag of the nation of Israel, sometimes called a Jewish star, the intersecting 2 triangles. But star is misleading. It has an image like a star if we're used to a 5-pointed star, and we call this a 6-pointed star. But it's referred to as a magen, as a shield. And it doesn't look like a shield in that form, but if it was on something that you were using like a banner, then it would operate as your shield. So that's the Magen David. But here's the Magen of the Gibborim, which is to say of Saul and Jonathan. It's named as the Magen of Saul in the parallel here. The words are defiled. Nigal here, again, only here in the Deuteronomistic history. As a commentator notes, a not very common verb chosen, probably because it uses 3 of Gilboa's 4 letters. Gilboa has abhorrence built into its very name. That's a possibility, but it's a possibility that's also connected with the liturgical elements that we're hearing here. And we'll refer back to that, not today, but another time when it'll echo later. So the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, anointed, using the word for Messiah here, and all the elements that we saw in the 1st and 3rd poems, Hannah's and the one in 2 Samuel 22, of referring to the anointed king. But here's the anointed shield, whereas a number of scholars noted the shield would have been made of leather. Here's an image of something like that, and it would be anointed with oil in the sense of kept fresh so the leather doesn't crack, etc. As I used to do with my baseball glove when I was a young kid. I guess kids don't do that so much anymore. So here the shield is referring to his leather shield. And the word for no more is also an unusual word. Bali here, it's an adjective of negation, meaning wear out, but again, it's only here in Samuel, although it's 59 times in the Masoretic text. So notice a number of words unique here, interestingly, despite the fact that there are these connections with the 1st and 3rd poems. And finally for today, from the blood of the slain and the fat of the mighty, and as my note below has, from Polzin, blood and fat are almost always exclusive use in biblical context of cultic ritual or sacrifice. Recalling the blood and fat of the animals not slain by Saul in his encounter with the Amalekites, he not only saved the king, but he served the best of the cattle. And when he denied it, recall that Samuel said, then what's this bleating of sheep that I hear and the lowing of cows? And so many hints of the issue issue of worship elements here. The blood of the slain, which is used only in this poem here and in 1 Samuel 31, recalling that, and only about Goliath. Another one of those things that's words that's only associated with the Goliath story and these deaths here, along with Gibbor, with Goliath as a Gibbor. So implicitly, the Goliath story is also in the background here. So the blood of the slain and the fat of the mighty, which is an interesting element here, that Jonathan wouldn't turn back from the blood of the slain. If they're already dead, what would he be doing with the blood of the slain? And what would he be doing with the fat of the Gibbors? There's certainly nothing in the Hebrew Bible about offering human fat as an offering to Yahweh, other than the implicit element that these deaths, these murders, military deaths as they may be, are understood as pleasing Yahweh here, as a cultic sacrifice of these enemy bodies. But of Saul and Jonathan's bodies as sacrifices is an interesting element. That's not, of course, what's being referred to here. What's being referred to here are the bodies of those that Jonathan or Saul killed. The bow of Jonathan did not turn back here. Again, and maybe that's the reason for the Song of the Bow, making it about Jonathan in particular, or the sword of Saul here. And as Linnefelt notes, the irony, the sword of Saul and the sword then, the story of Saul and the sword then goes from his failure to kill when he should have, the beginning of the story, to killing when he should not have, the middle, to killing himself, the end. Hardly a story of martial prowess. And the word for return empty, or the phrase for return empty, tashub for return, which is a very frequent word, but rekam here only for the return of the ark back in 1 Samuel 6:3 and a couple of times in Deuteronomy for empty-handed, and that's literally what it means to. So this phrase to return empty-handed there. So that gets us through the first element of this song, and as we continue, we'll see how what we're hearing reflects what we know about David's attitude towards Saul and Jonathan and what is true or not. But we'll wait to do the evaluation till we're done. See you for the next stanza next time. Bye-bye.